I am not someone who usually watches reality television. But several years ago, I think it must be at least about 10 years ago, there was a very popular reality television show that everyone was talking about. Perhaps you saw it. I even brought myself to watch it occasionally. It was called Undercover Boss. Any of you remember that one? Undercover Boss? Okay, a few of you do. The show always followed this interesting script, this interesting plot line. An executive, the president, the CEO, or someone like that of a given company, would leave the comfort of his plush office and go to work in his own company, disguised as just another employee, working alongside all the workers, and to see firsthand how his executive decisions would affect his employees, what problems there were in his company, and see up close and personal the pros and cons of working for him. And in the process, the executive would often discover the unsung heroes and heroines who made his company succeed. Then, at the end of the show, the executive would surprise his workers by revealing his identity and sharing what he had learned as their undercover boss. And then at the very end, he would call into his office the employees who had worked especially hard and surprisingly rewarded them. Now, in case you haven't realized it, something like that is going on in today's gospel. The parable is the third and final parable in Matthew 25 about Judgment Day, the last day, the great reckoning. First, there were the two parables of the bridesmaids and the talents, and now the sheep and the goats. Now, Jesus' audience was very familiar with this scene, this setting. You know, the sheep and the goats, they had been grazing together in the fields all day, but at dusk, the herdsman, the shepherd, must separate them between the sheep and the goats. And the separation is a picture of Judgment Day, that last day when God finally looks at the evidence on his camera, when God will decide who is in and who is out. And that could happen to any one of us when we breathe our last or the world comes to an end. And you know, for us, it really doesn't matter. Do you remember, no, I know I'm dating myself, those old Burma shave signs that used to line the sides of the country highways before interstates? One sign after another would spell out in a short, pithy statements some bit of wisdom or advice. Some would remind us that, Judgment Day is coming. You better not shout. You better not pout. Your time is running out. Prepare to meet your God. Burma shave. Both the Burma shave signs and today's parable warn us that a final judgment is coming. So, be prepared. On that day, God will decide whether we are in or out, saved or lost. God saved the sheep because they cared for Jesus by caring for the poor and lonely. And God turns away the goats because they did not care for Jesus. They did not by caring for the poor and the lowly. So, moral of the story, as you did it to the least of these, says Jesus, you did it to me. Therefore, care for the poor and lowly, or else. But there is something very odd in this story. I think that's the key to unlocking the good news here. The final outcome surprises both the sheep and the goats. Both did not realize that by caring for the poor and lowly, they were caring for Jesus. They did not know that Jesus was like an undercover boss disguised among them. Both ask, when did we see you in the poor and the lowly? Now it appears to be the same question, but there are actually two very different questions. The sheep are surprised that by caring for the poor and lowly that they had cared for Jesus. But even if they would have known, it would not have changed their behavior. That's simply what sheep do. They care for others. Their question almost seems rhetorical, implying its own answer. It was as if they were saying, oh, so that's what we did. We had no idea, Jesus. But thanks for telling us. For the goats, the question meant something entirely different. And if they had only known that Jesus was there, disguised in the poor and lowly, they would have acted differently. If they had only known that Jesus was watching and keeping score, they would have cared for the poor and the lowly. Not so much because they really cared for the poor and the lowly, but because then they would look good and score points and pass the final judgment. Why did the sheep act the way they did? Because that's how sheep act. And why were they sheep? Because, as the text says, they had been chosen from eternity. God had chosen them because God loved them, because they trusted that promise. And with such faith in their hearts, they were not worried about scoring points, getting credit, or passing judgment. The score had already been satisfied. They were free to be who they were. They were simply sheep acting like sheep. They cared for others because, why? Well, someone needs our help. They didn't need to accumulate brownie points or impress an undercover boss. So why did the goats act the way they did? Because that's how goats act. Goats, you see, do not trust God. They had no faith in God. They had only faith in themselves. They wanted to be in charge. They wanted to score points. They would have cared for the poor and the lonely because it would have benefited them. And they're always interested in a reward and a pat on the back. If we had only known that you were an undercover agent, Jesus, we would have acted differently. So where does that put us? Where are we? Sheep or goats? Are we in or out? If your life is anything like mine, the evidence is scary. A lot of my life looks pretty goatish. as I drive through those dangerous neighborhoods and make sure the doors in my car are locked and the windows up. And I do not look at those poor beggars at the stop sign. My life does not look much like a sheep. I would not want to stake my life on the evidence of God's great video. But the good news is that we do not have to stake our lives on the degree to which we have cared for the least of these. For God will not let God's love be stunted, even by us and our goatishness. Because this parable, as I said in the children's message this morning, is not the end of the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus' story, you see, is not over. For in Jesus we see God comes ultimately not to judge and condemn, but to save and redeem. Even though we have failed to see him in the least of these, God will not lose sight of us. Jesus comes literally as the least of these, disguised as an undercover boss, not keeping score, but loving and forgiving. Disguised as a lowly babe in Bethlehem. Disguised as an ordinary carpenter's son from Galilee. Disguised as the friend of sinners and outcasts. Disguised as the despised, rejected, and crucified Messiah. Disguised, he comes to love the damnable goats of this world, to reverse the fate we goats deserve. Jesus will not reject us. Remember, he promised that in our baptism. He's never going to revoke that baptismal promise. He promised to not reject us, even though we have repeatedly rejected him. He offers himself for us and suffers the fate we goats deserve. Surprise! God, the ultimate judge, is impressed not with us, but with Jesus. For God raises Jesus from the dead and reverses his verdict on all of us goats who deserve nothing other. Oh, we've heard that, haven't we, the last month? Saving us from the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. God looks at us standing there as goats, ashamed, embarrassed, and says, "Oh, thumbs up. You do not need to act like goats who failed to get their way. Oh, look at my son. Look at what he did for you. You are people of my pasture. You are sheep of my hand. And just so you won't doubt or forget that promise, let me wash you in the waters of the font. Let me feed you with my body and blood at my table. Let me assure you of the promise of the forgiveness of sin. Let me undo the terror of the last day. Let me transform you from goats to sheep." And trusting that promise, we are no longer goats butting our way through the world, pushing others aside so we can get to the front of the line. No, we get to be sheep. We get to see and hear things differently. We see our shepherd leading the way and tell him, "Oh, Jesus, thanks for telling us who we are. We would never have figured it out on our own. You see, we no longer need to live in fear, but we can joyously anticipate the completion of what has already begun. We no longer have to justify ourselves or prove our worth. We no longer have to keep score or worry about who is watching. What was once hidden is now revealed. There, in the least of these, we see Jesus. Little Johnny was confused. He was not sure that Dad really loved him. Daddy, do you love me? Well, of course I do, Johnny. Don't ever forget that I loved you. Do you remember, Johnny? Do you remember when you took out the garbage? Do you remember when you cleaned up the backyard? Do you remember when you helped me wash the car? Do you remember when you brought me that cup of coffee? Yes, Dad. But you didn't have to tell me to do those things. I mean, Dad, I would have done them anyway. You're my dad. And Dad says, oh, that's precisely the point, Johnny. If I did not love you, then why would you be doing things like this? You wouldn't, you see, because only my boy, only my son, only my little Johnny would do things like that without me having to tell him. Surprised, Johnny exclaims, oh, well, I never thought of carrying out the garbage, or of cleaning up the backyard, or of helping you wash a car, or bringing you that cup of coffee like that, ever. And Dad says, oh, Johnny, I didn't tell you because that would have spoiled it. It's so much better when you do these things because you want to, not because I have told you that you have to do them. And Johnny says, Dad, you're right. Thank you for reminding me. I needed that. And so we go to work and school and do our best and look out for the least of these. We come to this place and give of our time and talent because there is a need to serve. No one says here, you have to. We do it because we want to. We're generous not because someone is keeping score, not because there's some undercover agent keeping track of our performance. No, we do it simply because someone is in need. We want to help. I mean, isn't that what sheep do? Isn't that how God's kids act? Isn't that how we love Jesus? But you ask, well, Pastor, I didn't know that. If I had only known it was Jesus. Oh. But I say, I don't want to spoil the gift. I just wanted to let you sheep be sheep. And on this day of Christ the King Sunday, we rejoice that Jesus is indeed King. That means he has the last word. He wants us to trust that glorious announcement. Come, my beloved sheep. Welcome to my kingdom. Meet me in the poor and the hungry and the naked and the lonely, in the least of these. Welcome. Welcome to my kingdom, sheep. Hallelujah. Thanks be to God. Amen.